threefold path in our study through the Old Testament book of Job. We make it to the fourth chapter today, and this is going to be the first of the times when the three that had come to see him, his friends, is going to have something to say in this. So usually I would just kind of go right through chapter 4 and into chapter 5, and it would be what Job has said is chapter 3, now what his counselor or his friend has to say is 4, and then there's going to be Job's reply. I'll probably do it just here and go into a lot more of some of the things that I believe are kind of implied and why it's important that we understand the book of Job. And so I'll take my time with this first one of the dialogues, if you will, that are held between Job and his friends. And the reason I'll do that is because there are a lot of things that are sometimes very directly said and other things that are there by implication. But you're going to notice as we go through this, if you've never studied through the book of Job, or maybe even if you have, you're going to notice that they're always coming back to the same thing. And that same thing is just simply this. Job, the problem has to be with you. It has to be. And so we're going to take a look at it through that lens. There's basically three separate parts to what Eliphaz has to say. And the first 6 verses, and then there's 2 other sections that are in this that are part of the opening part of what he says. Now, what he has listened to thus far is what Job had to say in chapter 3. And it was, remember, we've already heard that he didn't lose his integrity. He kept his integrity through and through. The first time that he addresses anything and says anything verbally, his whole thing is, you can tell, I can't understand why these things are happening. I don't understand the reason behind them. Yet his misery is just beyond belief. And he says pretty much, it would be better that I was never born. It would be better if the day on which I was born was never remembered. That's just a way of expressing an exasperation and just a real brokenness in this whole thing. He's a distraught and even a destroyed man at this point. And so, of course, there's that whole thing about it would be better that I had died in my infancy or before I was even born. And, given what's happened to him, it's pretty hard to not come to that kind of conclusion, or to say those kind of things, just if nothing else, out of sheer frustration. So with all of that said, he says this at the very end of it, that thing that I feared the most has come upon me. And whether that means that he had really spent all of this time thinking about all the intricate details of what's taken place, or if it's just more in the big picture. What if everything that I have in my possessions and the things in which I put stock, and even my health and the well-being of my family and all that, what if it was taken away in a moment? And that's a fearful thing. And so he's clearly come to grips with that, and now that thing that he feared the most has come upon him. Now, here's the thing that's really, really helpful for us, because we're going to talk about the application of it before we even read into the text. So in both cases, whether it's Job or this first of his friends, Eliphaz, when they say what they say, they are operating, both of them, on not just limited information, but really no information as to why all of this has happened. It's why his counsel, though it's not necessarily bad if Job was guilty as they assume, it wouldn't be bad counsel, because it would make Job kind of, if it was true what they were saying, and Job was just really kind of living a double life, he's one thing on the outside, but he's a hypocrite, then if there's a person living in hypocrisy, it's a good thing to say, look, God doesn't put up with hypocrisy. And everything that you've been doing and hiding and that's been going on behind the scenes, it's found you out. And there is, an element of truth to that, if that was ultimately what was going on behind here. We think of where the Bible says that surely your sin will find you out, those kind of things. And God's not mocked. What a man sows, that will he reap. We can look at those kind of passages. And if they really were the life of Job, and if the opening part of this book wasn't there for us, we would be operating in the dark just as they were. So what we know is that Job never lost his integrity. But the things that he will end up saying from chapter 3 and then in the dialogue with his friends, at the end of this whole thing, God is going to make all of it known to him and say, though you never sinned and you didn't make the accusation against me, there were a number of times when his conclusions that he had reached and the assumptions that he had made kind of made it seem as though God was not careful, not caring, and not paying attention, or whatever else might be like that, and somehow negligent. But he doesn't get to the point of just making accusations and cursing God as was said in the beginning. But let's do this reset because it's super important for us to remember. It is the opening chapters, 1 and 2 of this, that really sets the table for all of this. None of what happened to Job was because of anything that he had done or hadn't, that he had done or hadn't done. None of this was punitive. And let's make sure we say this as well, because again, if we're believers and we're studying through this book, there are times when we are expected to give our counsel, and we will be talking with people and giving them our input. Sometimes it's asked for and sometimes it's not. But boy, oh boy, if you're going to speak about things and how God does what he does, you had better make sure that you understand everything before you start to open your mouth in these matters. Or at least, if you don't know for sure, then don't speak as though you've got it all figured out. Because again, they're all going to have their moment where they have to be reminded of the things that they had said in the midst of all of this. But there is the bigger picture of all of this. The day-to-day life of Job was thrown into absolute chaos, turmoil, wreckage, destruction, all because of an accusation. Not against Job, an accusation against God, and that he puts his finger on the scale for one person over another. And only those people that God favors will love him in turn because he gives them favor. That's the accusation. And ultimately, I believe, and you've probably heard me say it in the first couple of weeks, it is because of that accusation could not go without being worked out. And ultimately, the reason for that was because if you could make the case that that was it, and God didn't have it proven out, if you will, then that accusation would be able to hold for eternity. And people would be able to say, if only you had favored me like you favored Job, I would have chose to walk with you as well. But I lived a life of difficulty and struggle and trouble and whatever you want to say. So this was something that was going to have to play out. Something that Job has no concept of. His counselors will have no concept of it. And it almost at times becomes a little bit adversarial between Job and these men because they continue to insist, you're the problem. You've done something. Even though you say you haven't, obviously you had, because simply God does not do this to good people. And remember that he wasn't there, Eliphaz and his friends were not there at the time that Job had said to his wife, should we be able to expect God's blessing, but then have those, should we somehow not be willing to accept if there's a time when God doesn't give us everything and we have times of trouble? And that just shows an incredible perspective to realize that we are not owed anything, nor are we deserving of anything in the material sense. No matter what some segments of the church might want to tell us, we aren't entitled to anything. And so it's very, very important that we understand that. It's just something that's kind of basic to Christianity. So importantly that we understand the backdrop of this whole thing. And once again, I think it is a very, very important thing that we recognize that there may be times that God lets there be real difficulty in our life because there's something that needs to be learned or taught to us. There are times that we will leave his protection and him watching out for us because we rebel against him, and then calamity will befall a person like that potentially. And it's not because God caused it, because he's not punitive. But at the same time, you can't expect to have all of the benefits that would come along with walking rightly before God when you reject him at every turn. So you can see that there's an element of truth in this potentially. But again, since Eliphaz can't know that for sure, he's making the assumption that that's the case. And there's a very much, I guess, kind of a human way of looking at things that, well, God, why would God let good or bad things happen to good people? And I've mentioned this over the last couple of weeks, and it's a fair question. But again, it helps us to recognize that we live in what is very much a fallen creation. And so I've watched people who honor God with everything in their life, for some of them for their entirety of their life, others for a majority of their life, and they go through incredible struggle. And yet at the end of it, they just say, look, God doesn't owe me a thing. He's saved me, and I have this assurance of his love and his protection, and that I will spend my eternity with him. So whatever happens to me here in this temporal world is not compares. It's not to be compared. I think I made that mention last week. And so we should always be in that mindset, is that God, if I'm having trouble and difficulty, is God trying to teach me something through this? Is it just one of those things? It is life. It's not that God's causing it. It's not that he's, not paying attention to it. Am I just going through something and I will never really fully understand the bottom line to it until it's revealed to me and I see him face to face? And can we be as Job was in that first chapter, is that naked came I in, and that's the same way I'm going to go out, blessed be his name, and worship him even in the midst of it. So it's a sad thing that much of the church believes that we are entitled to some kind of benefit or multitudes of benefits, whether it's health or prosperity in material things and riches and all the rest, and that usually all goes together. But that's just what's taught by churches, but it's not what's supported in Scripture. And this book, if anything, is a great indication of that. Job did everything that could possibly be done right, and yet look at the calamity that befell him. So it's just really a very fascinating kind of, there's so many pieces to this, and it really is this is a deeply theological book when it's written in as poetic and wisdom, and yet what it really is it demonstrates so much about God's nature and what we can know about him. And Job is really a kind of almost a textbook of being careful when we are asked and put in a place of giving counsel, making sure that our counsel is absolutely right and correct, and not to be in a place of fear when we offer that counsel, personal fearfulness, not because we're worried about what they'll hear, but because we might be moved to say something because the opposite of it terrifies us on a personal level. In this case, same thing. These guys are going to finally come to the conclusion, I'm sure of it, that they're thinking, well, wait a minute, if Job is really not guilty of anything as he says, and Job will even say, look, I have offered before God in case I forgot something that I'm not aware of. I've even acknowledged that, though I can't remember any particular thing, but I've said, God, even if I have offended you in some way that I don't recall, I'm asking that you would forgive. So the idea that is all going on is a really fascinating thing. And it argues against what there are some in our world today would tell you. Basically, we should be entitled to all manner of different types of blessings and material things because we're God's kids. Well, this argues against that. So we want to be very careful about how it is that we offer counsel when it's given, and to make sure if we're going to say this is what I believe that God is doing, well, make sure it's not opinion, and you better make sure that it has good foundation, because when we give people counsel, if it's bad counsel, we'll answer to God for that, because we've done harm to those that he loves. So it is a very, very big deal when we start giving opinion, or if we start giving, quote, counsel. We don't want to be quick to do that. And what we want to do, as James would say, we want to be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to anger. And so that's a hugely important thing that we would want to be mindful of. And whenever we're consulted to do something, we really should take that to the Lord and say, God, give me wisdom and make sure that I'm representing what your heart is in this, because I do not want to lean on my own wisdom and understanding. There's just nothing but trouble in that. So really a fascinating part of this book. I want to leave chapter 4 by itself. And again, you're going to see similarities in this as we get to the other guys, because they're going to sound kind of repetitious. And much of Job and his defense of himself will also seemingly be repetitious. And so we'll be able to move through the middle parts of this fairly quickly. I mean, it's not like we're going to get done in a few weeks, but I don't have to take as much time in the next weeks because there's going to be some repetition to this. So we'll take chapter 4 because it says what we're going to hear repeated a lot, but we can take a little bit of time with it this first time through and point out some of the major things. So again, I believe that Eliphaz is in a place based on the available knowledge that's there and what they perceive to be true. God would never do this to somebody who's walking rightly before him. And they're believing that whether or not, as the accusation by Satan went, that God will bless those who are right towards him, but the person that is not right towards him can expect calamity and destruction and that it's going to be a vehicle that God can get them in that right frame of mind by just laying waste to their things. And really, if that was how God operates, you can see it's just not genuine. It's not biblical, if you would say. But again, they don't have the benefit as we would of all the writing. And so I still know that it happens today where people counsel as well. They just go based on what maybe they've heard somebody else say. But, ultimately here, people are not entitled to anything. They're not entitled to good things just because they're walking right with God. And they're certainly not entitled to some kind of him taking out revenge on them for their lack of faith and all the rest of that. Let's just remember that every human soul is born into this world separated from God. And that's what Jesus would say, look, this world is already condemned. This is what he picks up in chapter 3 of John's Gospel in verse 17, that the Son of Man did not come to condemn the world, but that through him, it may be saved. So the world is already in its way of condemnation, and God is going to judge it. That judgment has already been made. It's just, when will justice be meted out? Sin is what God has judged. And in the person of Jesus, in that judgment, he's given man a way out if they will take what he's offered to them. But for the person that will not accept that, they're already condemned because their deeds are evil. And that's what he ends up saying in the next few verses. So we want to remember, again, it's a very New Testament understanding. Here we have what I believe is a very, very old book prior to the giving of the law, prior to also the time of Moses and any of that kind of stuff, prior to the temple. So this would be, I believe, more in the contemporaries around Abraham's time. And so his knowledge of God would be what Abraham's was. And just because they're not living in the land of Israel, let's just remember that for Abraham's whole time that he was alive, once he made it to Israel, was just a sojourner. So the borders were not really necessarily as important to Abraham at the time as they became to the children of Israel when they came in after the Exodus. Because ultimately what God had offered to Abraham was a much larger plot of land than anything that Israel ever took. Because it really is, it's 4 or 5 times the size, if I can just, in my mind's eye, try to think of it, maybe even more than that. But it is a multiple times larger section of land than the modern state of Israel is. That's what was offered to Abram in chapter 15 of the book of Genesis. So with all of that said, when we jump into this, again, the big picture, Job has said what he has said. He's in a place of just brokenness and frustration and anguish and pain and grief. And he just says, I would rather have never been born. It would be better that my day of my birth would be blotted out. And he says all of that. And it's just said from such a broken place. You can tell, obviously, what a sad situation. And then at the end of it, that thing that I feared the most, it has come upon me. In fact, let's just go ahead and read that, and then we'll look at the text. In verse 25, he says of chapter 3, for the thing that I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, for trouble comes. So of all of the things that he says, it can be just kind of boiled down to that right there. The life that he had been relatively one of comfort, and it was of peace and no difficulty, and he had excess of things. God had blessed him immensely. And the thing that he had feared the most had come upon him. So by this time, again, the material things are probably very much down the list secondarily, but the fact that he's just in horrible agony physically because of all the torment that's happened to him, but he's lost his family, and he's lost people that were close to him, of his servants and the people who were in his employ, if you will, or they served under him or for him. So that seems to be what he's referring to. This is when Eliphaz has what he says, or says what he says, and this has been after they've been there for a week, and clearly it took them for some time to get there. So this is long after the events first happened, so they're familiar with the history. So this Eliphaz says some things, and again, we can learn from what he says in that under some circumstances, his counsel may have been correct. In Job's, it is completely wrong because he doesn't know any of the details behind it. He just makes assumptions. And he comes off, as I read it, I can't come at it any other way. he comes off as a bit too self-assured, like he's got it all figured out, when it turns out that he doesn't. And so there almost seems to be almost a little bit of a pridefulness or an arrogance to him, because it's not like, I may be wrong in this, but here's what I do know. It's like, no, this is really what the problem is, Job, and you should be able to see it for yourself. Let me make you aware of it, and you're going to need to come to this conclusion as I have, that you're the problem. It's kind of the way it's laid out here. So let's have a word of prayer and let's take a look at the text. Father, we thank you for the time that we can come together and study your word. And again, we're looking back at a historical event from such a long time ago. We know so little of the history around the time and when it took place, but we do have a very clear understanding of the things that were said in heaven, how they were played out here on earth, and the earthly people couldn't have had the slightest idea, as they were in the middle of it, of what you were actually doing. And clearly that is shown in the text, and it will all come full circle towards the end. Will you help us to see that and to understand it? May we be careful of our counsel, and before we open our mouths, especially if we're doing so for your people, and if they've sought us out for our counsel, may we know your heart, and may we represent you accurately, Lord, that we might not have to stand before you someday and give account for our bad counsel as well. So we give you thanks, we give to you all praise in Jesus' name. All right, so I'm going to read the first 6 verses because it's like the opening part of it, and then we'll go back and look at it. So, Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, if one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? But who can withhold himself from speaking? Surely you have instructed many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have upheld him who is stumbling, and you have strengthened the feeble knees. But now it comes upon you, and you are weary. It touches you, and you are troubled. Is not your reverence your confidence, and the integrity of your ways, is that not your hope? So even in this first 6 verses, it's kind of almost an indictment, a bit of an indictment against Job, in that there are a few things. Let's look at the first 2 verses, because they're what sets everything up here. If one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? Job, I think I've got this figured out, but I don't know if you're willing to hear it from me. Now, so I'm going to try to paraphrase this, because the English from the Hebrew can sometimes sound even more poetic than we might say it if we were having a similar discussion or we were the ones counseling. So his whole point is, if I was to give you what really is taking place here, what's really going on, you've made your assumptions and I've listened to you and you're woe is me kind of thing. But let me go ahead and just give you a dose of reality here. And you could see that almost arrogance and that pridefulness, that he's got it all figured out, when he clearly does not. All he's looking at is the circumstances, but he has no clue of what's taking place in the spiritual side. So let that just be a reminder as you read this. Man, I don't want to be this guy. Though everything on the outside, exterior, looks like you've got it figured out. But man, you should really make sure you take this to the Lord before you say, here's your problem, because you're going to indict Job for something he's not guilty of. So, if one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? So, Job, if I was to try to tell you what I think is wrong here and what's gone on, are you gonna just tune me out? Are you going to become weary, or are you going to listen to it? So the second part of it, but who can withhold himself from speaking? So his point is, you may take this the wrong way, but I can't help but say the things that need to be said as he reckons them. Now, keep this all in mind, because God's going to have his words for each of the counselors, and he'll have his words for Job at the end of things. So, verse 3, surely you have instructed many, and you have strengthened weak hands. It basically means you've had people that have been in the same position that you are in currently, and as Eliphaz thinks, the problem is with you. So as he says this here, we all are to assume that Eliphaz, from what he knows of Job, Job has counseled people as Eliphaz is counseling Job. And for the same reasons. There are troubles in your life, there is this, that, and the other thing going on. And really all of the indicators point back to you as the problem, and that you can't expect God's blessings when you're rebellious against him. And that's really the underlying, the current that runs through all of their counseling that they're going to give to Job, all of his counselors, his friends. I'm going to say basically the same thing. So you've done exactly what I'm doing here. Eliphaz says, look, everything I'm telling you, you've told somebody else at some time. So it's time for you to sit there and listen. Don't become weary. I have to say these things as you have felt the need to say them to other people. So don't become high and mighty and take your own counsel through my lips. So your words have upheld those who are stumbling, verse 4, and you have strengthened the feeble knees. But now that it comes upon you and you are weary, it touches you and you are troubled. So everything that you have said could very well be just that God is doing this because of something that you've done. Now that it's your turn, Job, you're the one who's saying, woe is me. Why do I have to even be born? Why did it ever even take this place, or this ever take place? Why was I ever born? Why don't we just forget it ever took place? Let it be cursed, and all of that stuff. And so Eliphaz is saying, you wouldn't have put up with it when somebody would have brought those things to you when you were counseling them. So why are you now insisting that you are somehow not guilty in this? So basically it's Eliphaz pointing back to whatever he may know or thinks that he knows about times past with Job. But again, he's operating under a false premise that Job has something that he has done that has raised the ire of God, as though God deals with people in some kind of a punitive sense. It's just a terrible thing to say about him. So, but now it comes upon you and you're weary. It touches you and you're troubled. Is not your reverence your confidence? And your reverence is that fear of God that you're telling everybody else that they should have, that you say that you have. Well, how is that not then your confidence now? You have this reverence, this fear of God, and yet in the midst of your calamity, have you abandoned it? Now, it's a pretty ridiculous thing for him to say, and it shows how little he actually knows about what's going on with Job. He's basing all this on what Job says in that moment. He has no idea what he said during the throes of it in the first 2 chapters, and how much integrity Job did show in those times. If God's going to bless us, we're going to accept that. This is chapter 2. We've got to be willing to accept it when things don't go as we want them to. Or in the first, God gives, God takes away. Naked came I in, that same way I'm going to go out. Blessed be his name. So those are the sayings of a man of immense integrity, recognizing I'm not owed anything. Well, here Eliphaz apparently has no knowledge or no concept of those things that he had said. He's basing all of this on Job's calamity and the things that he has just said. Now Eliphaz is going to set everything straight, and it's almost kind of it's a challenge. I wouldn't put it at the place of mockery because he's a friend. Or if it's said later on, some of these guys will say some of their stuff out of their frustration, because we keep telling you you're the problem and you keep telling us, Job, you're not the problem. We're sick of your, trying to convince us otherwise. Clearly you're the problem here. And so it doesn't seem as it's said yet quite that adversarial, but he ends up saying to him, and it touches you and you are not troubled. Verse 6. If is not your reverence or your fear of God, is that not your confidence? Don't you have confidence in your own words and what you've said, the second part? And the integrity of your ways, isn't that your hope? And so if you have some kind of integrity, then that integrity would say, yeah, you guys are right. I'm wrong. I did this, I did that, and God will forgive me. That's my hope, kind of a thing. So it's kind of a reflection back on, Job, you say one thing, but is what you're saying to us, is it really trustworthy? And you say that you have this reverence for God. Well, is that your confidence now that things have been put to a challenge? And then the second part of those whole things, is this, as he says here, the second part of verse 6, the integrity of your ways. Isn't that what your hopefulness is? Don't you put your confidence and your trust in that, your integrity? Well, if they could prove that it's his own actions and sinfulness that he won't own up to, that would be a shot against his integrity. So this is pretty much an indicting kind of a thing, and yet it's being presented to him and said to him in a way that's supposed to be comforting, but drawing out let's not let this go on any longer, Job. Let's put it out all there on the table. Let's not live under the pretense. Just own up to whatever it is that you've done, and then you can get back to that place. Don't have your integrity cannot stay intact if you claim your innocence and yet your troubles persist. So again, it goes to the faulty premise. God would not allow bad things to happen to good people. It's just not the way that he does things. Well, there's nothing in the scripture that would say that. In fact, if we were going to try to have that asked of us, what would we give as an answer? And so we might think of a verse here, a verse there. Let's just drop the whole book of Job in their lap and say, well, here, let's put your theory to the test. God won't let bad things happen to good people. Read the book of Job and explain that to me. That premise falls apart under examination when you look at it, how it happened in a person's life. We're not owed anything in this life. So, the second part of this, and it runs verses 7 through 11. Let's read them and then we'll go back. Remember now, whoever perished being innocent. So it's a rhetorical question. Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright ever cast off? Even as I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. It's very similar wording to sowing to the wind, but reaping the whirlwind rather. By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his anger they are consumed. The roaring of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, and the teeth of the young lions are broken. The old lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lioness are scattered. And so these are just, if you will, kind of observations. Here's the things that I have seen in my time. And, as far as Job is concerned, could Job say the same thing? Could I even say the same thing? And when it comes to this, that, everything has its time, everything has its season, and the way that life works, the ebbs and flows of it, what may be here today is different tomorrow. But see, again, the underlying reason of why things would go from a place of order to a place of disorder is always going to be, in their reckoning, because somehow they had run afoul of God, whether knowing or unknowing. They are in a place of his chastisement and his judgment about something, and only if they will acknowledge that before him can they begin that idea of reconciliation and healing and reparation. So, as he says this in verse 7, here's just this simple question. Remember now, whoever perished being innocent. So, I can think of a lot of those. So, will trouble fall people who are standing rightly before God? At that time, as they would understand it, that this wouldn't happen. So their understanding is a little different than what ours is. And why that is, I don't know. Maybe they just had ignored the fact that sometimes righteous people do suffer. Job seemed to understand it. Look at what he said. Again, I've already quoted it from chapter 2, that, can we expect good things and have a problem if God doesn't allow always good things to happen? Sometimes trouble comes. Who are we to say that God's unjust in that? But it would seem from Eliphaz that if a person is right before God, they would never have this kind of calamity. And yet this is exactly what's taking place in Job's life. And neither Job nor any of the counselors, friends, have the slightest clue what had taken place in heaven. They're going to all kind of conclude, well, Job, I should say, kind of concludes that, I don't know, maybe God's just not watching these things. Maybe this is happening without his notice, somehow, some way. And yet, from heaven's perspective, all the people who heard the accusation, the angels and the hosts in heaven heard the accusation. Of course they're watching what's going on. God knows what's going to be the end result of it, but everybody else is just going, what's going to happen next? It's this fascination from the heavenly sense. And here on earth, it's like, what happened? Nobody can seem to have a good explanation for why things happened as they did. So he asks very simply this question, verse 7, remember now, who ever perished being innocent? Or where were the upright ever cut off? When would God have ever forsaken somebody who is walking rightly or upright before him? So again, it's a faulty assumption that God has somehow abandoned Job rather than allowed it to be proven whether or not Job held his integrity only because of his blessing. So that's the big question that's here, and Eliphaz has no clue that that's really ultimately what's in play here, and it's why all of these things are taking place. So right here, the answer to that question could be, although neither one of them would be able to say it, where were the upright ever cut off? If they see the calamity that's happened to Job, where has that ever taken place before if the man is innocent? Well, if you're looking for an example of it, they'll have to see it sooner or later because God's going to hold them responsible for it. But Job would have been that example. The upright that are cut off or that have everything that they had any trust in taken away in a day. And so that's the idea of being cut off. But where has that ever happened for the upright before? And again, maybe it's because they don't have any knowledge of where it had taken place before, or they had never experienced it themselves, or whatever it is. But from their limited understanding, Eliphaz in this case, it never happens. God doesn't take away things from people who are right before him. They're never cut off. They're never dealt with in this kind of a way where all of this calamity befalls them. So, verse 8. And as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble will reap the same. So, again, you can find plenty of passages long after this history where those kind of things are, that God's not mocked. What a man sows, that will he reap. I can think of a number of those kind of passages that will say that, they're going to be judged for the things that they do. The fruit of their lives is going to be the thing that stands in judgment of who they are. So there is a truth to this. But again, it has to be that the person that has had it happen to them is actually guilty of some kind of sin, where God is going to say, look, this is a just reward for the things that you have done. So let's remember for ourselves, there's an element of truth in all of what Eliphaz had said. He's just operating under the faulty assumption that Job is a guilty man, as he supposes that he is. If Job was indeed guilty of these things, then everything that Eliphaz has to say would be pretty hard to object to. So these are truths that are there, based especially on the limited understanding that they would have from what we can think. Nothing was written before this time. So the first of the formal writing of things, as far as doctrine and theology and stuff like that, is found in the books of Moses, basically from 3,500 years ago. If Job predates that 3,500 years ago, as I believe he does, then whatever is known wasn't necessarily written. It would have just been from, handed down through oral things. So once again, clearly he doesn't understand the eternal. He doesn't understand the heavenly things that are taking place. He's going only by what he sees evidentially in front of him, and he draws his conclusions that though Job says he's not, he must be guilty. So all of this is said in an attempt to try to draw from Job, why don't you just fess up? What is it that you have done? You keep trying to hold to your integrity and saying it's not, and yet it is. That's why you're going to see this escalates quite a bit as we go on. So, verse 9, by the blast of God they perish, these people, whoever they are that have these troubles befall them, and by the breath of his anger they are consumed. This is the judgment that God would have of those people who rebel against him, and they can't expect not to have some kind of trouble befall them, that God will not be blessing the things of the works of their hands. They will be judged. And so this is post-flood. They would certainly understand about that, because again, this would be a direct descendant of Noah, the Eliphaz and anybody else that's there, because there was only 8 people. So it was either Noah or his sons. It would be his sons, obviously. But they're from that genealogy of those 8 people that escaped the flood. And now the earth is repopulated. But what would be known of God was clearly known by Noah and by his sons and daughters and the generation. So it's not as though God is unknown to them. So really important that we keep all of that in our memory. Now, verse 10 tells us this. Now, the roaring of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion. There are a number of different types of lions that are mentioned here, and it's more about where they are in their life and what they do and how they interact. So, the roaring of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, the teeth of the young lion are broken. The old one perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs and the lionesses are scattered. This is just the ebb and flow of the life of things. And so it just shows that everything, whatever it was one day, is not necessarily the same way the next. And so it almost sounds a little bit like the like Ecclesiastes and the futility of life. It kind of has that same kind of a feel to it. But his whole thing is that whatever it was yesterday, it not necessarily today. So it's kind of Eliphaz's way of saying, look, there was a time when you were just kind of on top of the world, and now everything is scattered, and you're kind of using these analogies here. What happens in nature has now happened to you. So open your eyes, Job. What is it that you've done? God does not act punitively against people, and clearly you're doing something that is judgment from God. Well, in verse 12, there's something more. And this is an interesting thing. And again, there are times when I'll go and read what various commentators have to say about this too, just to see if I can glean something from them. As people that have also studied through these passages, and just see what they have to say on these topics. And most of them believe that whatever it is that Eliphaz says that he saw in a vision, They don't really mention whether or not they believe that it was God who had given this vision to him, or whether it was maybe even something that the devil had put there. The third option is just it's your imagination, that you're saying it was God showing you something and a spirit that showed you something, but it may just very well be your imagination. So, you can make the case for any of those things. Because let's think about it. If God gives him this message and he says these things to Job, it could be even God using this man who's not giving great counsel, but he's able to still speak by vision through him to Job, and then Job can see what to make of it. If it was the devil who gives this to him, it is meant as a discouragement to him. And if it is just his imagination, I saw this dream, this vision, well, people say they have dreams and visions all the time that never come to pass. So clearly it was just their own belief, their own mind concocting those things. So, again, just depends on who you ask. And we're not told specifically here, but it does seem of the options that are there, it does seem to me as I see it here of supernatural origin, but depending on how Job would react to it is probably a better way of telling who it was that actually sent it. So let's read verses 12 through 21, and then we'll take on the rest of that. So, now a word was secretly brought to me, and my ear received a whisper of it. So that tells you this is a dream. He's in a state where he's not completely awake. Did he wake when it started to come to him, or is it something that he remembered well after he woke? Again, it's not told to us in that directive language. So it says, now, in disquieting thoughts from the vision of the night, when a deep sleep falls on men, fear came upon me and trembling, which made my bones shake. And a spirit passed before my face, the hair on my body stood up, and it stood still. But I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes, and there was silence, and then I heard a voice saying. So we'll read the rest of that in just a moment, but think about from verses 12 to verse 16, it's more him just saying, there was a communication that was brought to me, and then he goes into that description of when it took place and what was his reaction. It was something that was paralyzing. His hair stood up. It's that you get those chills down your spine kind of a thing, which makes some people think it was he actually woke from his sleep at this point just to be in that place of paralysis, or as he envisions himself in this whole dream, when it took place, like he's watching it as a third party, he stood still and all the hair stood up on him as he's seeing himself. Again, depends on how you're going to read it. It doesn't change the outcome. Verse 17. So this voice says, can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? If he puts no trust in his servants, if he charges his angels with error, how much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, and who are crushed before moth. They are broken in pieces from morning until evening. They perish forever with no one regarding, and does not their own excellence go away? They die even without wisdom. So this vision that he gets asks this number of rhetorical questions. And they're meant for a person as they read them to just go, let me think of that or ponder what's being said. I'll think upon those things. Some of them are really obvious that you could give like an immediate answer. Other ones take a little bit more time to look at it. But again, it goes to the futility of life. None of us are eternal. None of us have it all figured out. We're here for a while and then we are gone. Like what James would tell us in chapter 4, we're here, we're a vapor. We're here for a moment and then we're gone. But here he has some other parts to this as well. This idea of the wisdom of God, and I can't help but see the irony in this, that he as this counselor, friend of Job, gives him what is not accurate counsel in that you're the problem, Job. And so that means that he's making this accusation without knowledge. He's just based on what he can see and maybe his own, if he would, common sense, or maybe even the fact that there's a little bit of fearfulness in him. Man, if this could happen to a good person, maybe we're next. And I think you're going to see a lot of that in the next of the counselors that he gives, or that give their counsel, rather. So let's look at them in verse by verse. Verse 17, can a mortal be more righteous than God? So If this is a thing of integrity and all the rest, who are you to be questioning who God is? Are you more moral? Are you a more upright person than God, who is the one who ultimately governs the affairs of men? So the Spirit asks this question. So again, if the Spirit is of God and giving this to him, this would be good counsel, and it would help Job not to jump to any conclusions regardless of what his counselors say. So remember, God's hearing everything that is being said here, and that's a good reminder for us. Everything that we say is heard by him, and there's an accounting of it. But this case here, again, as this person gives counsel, really they should both be listening to it. So Job, if it's directed at Job and it's God who's giving it to him, regardless of what Eliphaz may say, Job, here's a question for you, something for you to consider. If you think that you somehow understand my motives, Job, God speaking, then are you more upright than I would be? Could your motivations ever be questioned as opposed to mine? God would never be able to have his motivations questioned. And the reasons why he does things, they're beyond question. We may not understand them, but they're certainly not fickle and they're not futile. God doesn't have a good day and a bad day. He does everything that he does consistently, and there's nothing that he does without a reason. Man could never make such a claim. So, if it is God who is speaking to him, and I have no reason to believe it's not, this is not said as much for Eliphaz's ears, but for Job's. And Job should think through these things, but at the same time, Eliphaz should be listening very, very carefully as well. Because again, here Eliphaz is kind of putting himself in the place of, well, I'm not having the calamity that you are. And since I have everything intact and I'm walking right and honorably before God, and you say that you are, but you've got all the trouble, let's do the math here. Job, you must have something that God's displeased with in your life, or else you would be as I am. So that means he puts himself in a place of moral superiority, whether he realizes it or not. So he should listen to the same spirit. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? These are obviously questions that have an immediate answer. Well, of course not. Is man more righteous than God? No, of course not. Can a man be more pure than his maker? Certainly not. Impossible for that to be the case. And yet, if this is said by or Eliphaz sees this as his ability to say to Job, you're holding to your integrity, but at the same time you indict God that somehow you're more pure than he is, because he's the one, as Eliphaz sees it, he's the one who's causing these problems, and yet you deny that you've done anything wrong. So who can be right here? Is God somehow unrighteous for judging and letting these things go on in your life, even though you say you're not guilty? Somehow God missed something and he's just acting punitively towards you? See, that the whole thing, pretty crazy when you stop to think about it. So verse 18, if he puts no trust in his servants, when the he here, it's capitalized, you'll notice, speaking about God. If he puts no trust in his servants, or if he charges his angels with error, then how much more those who dwell in houses of clay? So the first part of this, if God is going to hold accountable those who are closest to him in the heavenly places, and they can't escape when they do wrong, how much more so us simple mortals who have such limited information? Who are we that somehow we could think and act defiantly and question God's motives, question his righteousness, question his integrity and his justice and judgment? Who are we to do that? So again, this is great counsel. It really is. If Job is actually guilty, and if he was, what's being said here is really excellent. And it's very, very true. And it really should put a person in a place of saying, you shouldn't be so presumptuous as to know these things or think that you know these things. You're very, very limited. So, verse 19, how much more so those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust? He knows how Adam was created. God created him from the dust of the earth. So that part was known. Wasn't written out yet, but they know the story of how God created. And so he says exactly that right here. And those who are broken in pieces, the second part of verse 19, who are crushed before a moth. Well, when you return back to dust, crushed. You're just, as far as a moth is concerned, when you go back to your base elements of what you were, dirt, dust, ash. Yeah. So verse 19 or verse 20 then says, they are broken in pieces from morning until evening. And again, there's no strength in them at that point. Once man is reduced to his elementary pieces, there's just no strength left in that, no matter how mighty they were. So, does not their own excellence go away, whoever they were, whatever they were? It's only here for a while. And again, this is the Spirit speaking, and it's speaking about the very temporary aspect of life. This is something that was given to Eliphaz to see and to hear, and then to pass along to Job. But again, remember, so often, and this is a good thing, again, a reminder for us, if God puts us in a place of counsel and all the rest of it, let's also remember that there very, very simply could be anything that we might say to somebody in the course of counseling or trying to give wisdom to them or help them through some kind of a situation. We better be looking very, very carefully and listening with intent and say, gosh, could any of this apply to me as well? Could I also be a co-beneficiary of what God is going to use me to say? Very, very important that we look at it that way as well. So, does not their own excellence go away? Doesn't it end up ultimately vanishing? It's gone sooner or later. They die even without wisdom. There's nothing that goes and goes up before them. They're just whatever they were, that was for here and for now. And so, once again, this message coming to Job, what would it be? What's the outcome of it? What's the result of it? So, he says a few things at the beginning. In the first part of that is like, I want to tell you this, and I don't know if you're going to listen to me, but just remember, you've given similar counsel to this, so really perk up your ears. It's a really important thing that you need to hear. The second part of it, God would not do this to a person who's not guilty of something. So, Job, look through your life. What is it that you have done? It's a false accusation based on a lack of knowledge. And so, unfortunately, just going with what you think you know, as he does here, you end up giving bad counsel, and you put it upon Job. And really, ultimately, it has nothing to do with whether or not Job did something good or bad. All of it is based on the accusation made against God in heaven. So, at the close of the last part of this, his point is, look, there's a futility of life, and I saw in a vision a spirit had asked me, does any man think that they can stand before God and say, I'm more righteous than you are? Can we question our own Creator? And then, so once again, this calamity that has befallen you, it has to have some source. There's a reason why it's all taken place. And so ultimately, the fingers are pointing back at you, Job. Even though you're a man who claims that you have your integrity intact, yet the events on the ground would seem to indicate otherwise. And so this is the opening salvo, if you will, of the debate that goes back and forth between these friends of his and Job. Now, you're going to find that this is going to be a very much a repeating pattern. We're going to take Job's reaction next week, probably on its own, just take chapter 5 by itself in the way that we did with chapter 4. But since there's going to be kind of a repetition in this, we'll be able to kind of move through it a little bit quicker. Now, in chapter 5, we'll just take a look at the first few verses here. Eliphaz continues about God's faithfulness. And that's actually, I'm sorry, I got the chapters mixed up. It's chapter 6 where Job actually gives his reply. So when we get to chapter 5, we're going to look at the second part of this because he continues out. Look at what he says. Call out now. This is Eliphaz speaking to Job. Is there anyone who will answer you? And to which of the holy ones will you now turn? So the point is, you're in this place of judgment. You're in this place where God has seen you fit to be the focus of his anger and his judgment and his punishment. So who are you going to cry out to now, Job? And so, again, it just shows a real disconnect of what he knows actually about Job based on only what Job said, not knowing the full course of what happened in the first couple of chapters, let alone what's happening on the heavenly side of this that they just genuinely cannot see. So really interesting. We'll pick up on chapter 5 next week. It's the second part of this. It's just obviously too much to try to do in one fell swoop. So we'll pick up at chapter 5 next week and get to the second part of what he has to say. Job's answer comes in chapter 6. We'll take care of that starting in a couple of weeks. So lot that's been said there. Really good for us to definitely take account of the way that we counsel people, and whether or not, if we're going to say, I really believe that this is what the Lord is saying, we had better know for absolutely sure that our counsel is solid, or we can say, best as I can tell, here's what I would know, but we had better not lock in on saying, thus says the Lord kind of stuff to people if we don't know that for sure. Because again, there's an accountability part to this as well. Super, super important. So really, again, fascinating study through this book. I hope that you're enjoying it as I am. Taught this book before, but like I've said in a couple of the studies that we've already done, it's like a book I've never seen fully before. It's just neat how God reveals things to you as you grow older in Him. Your next time through them, as you're studying them, it's one thing to read them, but studying them and preparing to teach on them, your preparation, your consideration goes a lot different than just reading them in a devotional sense. And the things that God shows you through the text, it's just neat. As you get older in Him, there are things that He'll reveal to you because you're kind of able to see Him and hear Him maybe that you weren't before. So it's just a very intriguing way that God does things by His Spirit. So with that, anything that I may have shared, love to hear from you if you have any questions about it. And I hope that, again, you're enjoying the studies through them. They are thought-provoking for sure. And if you have any questions about anything, any part of what I've shared here, contact us through the website. And that is found at oldpaththeology.net. We love to hear from you, and it's something you can send through the email, any questions that you might have, or you can ask them through the YouTube channel if that's how you're watching these as well. So with that being said, we'll pick up at chapter 5 next week for the second part of what Eliphaz has to say, and we'll pick that up next week.